Welcome to all of you to our third lecture on the history of English literature, part 3. A syllabus that is prescribed for the third semester students of BA English Main, Kerala University. And today's lecture is a continuation of our previous lecture, and it is a recapitulation of our previous class, we can say. We talked about the different reform acts of the 19th century Great Britain. And in our lecture today, we will talk about the different social changes that happened or that were brought about in the Victorian era or in the 19th century in Great Britain. We know that the Victorian era was to a large extent peaceful and prosperous, and as we have previously seen, along with scientific advancements, lot of technological progress, material growth, there were some social unrests and reform movements that would bring about considerable changes in the social life in Great Britain during the Victorian era. The social structure was still the hierarchical system with the upper class, the middle class and the lower class. We see that during this period of history in Great Britain, due to the rapid growth of the cities and the rapid growth of the economy because of industrialization, an expansion of the middle class would take place during the Victorian era. An expansion of the middle class. So you would ask, who forms part of this expanded middle class? This middle class were those who had the skilled jobs and who could support themselves and their families. This middle class consisted of the merchants, the shopkeepers, the bankers, those who worked in industries like railroads, banks and other government offices. Now these were the people who belonged to this middle class category. Now the lower class, the working class of the society, they consisted of the unskilled laborers who worked in terrible, unsafe working conditions. This poor working class, they experienced want of food, lack of water, lack of shelter, lack of education and even proper clothing. This poor middle class, they were unemployed and were very often addicted to drinks and drugs. Coming to women who were unskilled and could not get any jobs, they would take to prostitution to earn a living. So during the Victorian era, the England progressed exponentially, and this led to greater demand for labor from both the adults as well as children. Now one thing that we notice is that the child labor was becoming rampant in the country. Lot of demand for work. Children worked as coal miners, chimney sweepers, farm workers and even domestic servants. And many children suffered greatly at work. They were forced to work for 12 to 18 hours a day. They worked in mines that were infested with rats and diseases and had very poor ventilation. Thus the child labor was an overarching issue during the 19th century. We have discussed in our previous lecture the different reform acts, the different beneficial acts that were promulgated by the British Parliament, the Chartist movement, the People's Charter, etc. Now, all these social unrest and reform movements brought about substantial changes in the society. As we have seen in our previous class, the first Reform Act of 1832, it doubled the electorate by including many of the middle classes into the electorate. That was a big social change. It gave representation to the industrial towns like Manchester and Leeds. We have seen that. The Act reallocated or restricted the land so as to accommodate many industrial towns and reduce the inequality in the electoral representation. That was a big social change that happened after 1932 Act. The first Reform Act also diminished the economic influence of the aristocrats and increased the power of the House of Commons. Thus, the social change brought about by the first Reform Act was very substantial. The beneficial acts which we have discussed brought about by the Parliament also brought about changes in social life. We have seen about the Factory Act. The Factory Act, we have mentioned about the poor working condition in which women and the children or the working class had to work. The Factory Act would fix the number of working hours in industrial units, and it ensured better working conditions. And the Factory Acts would impose restrictions on the employment of women and the employment of children in factories. The children under 9, they were prohibited to work in the factories, and it was needed that elementary education was made compulsory and free for all children. Then we have talked about the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. The new Poor Law, it entrusted parishes with the responsibility of monitoring relief measures in times of difficulties, calamities. The law also saw to the rehabilitation of those persons who are able to work. Then we talked about the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835. It also would bring about some social change. The Act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom that reformed the local government in the incorporated boroughs of England and Wales. We also talked about the Mines Act of 1842. Now, this Mines Act of 1842 this would keep women and children out of the mines. We also said that the corn laws were repealed in 1846. The tariff on the foreign wheat was lifted and the common man could afford wheat at a lower price. This would end the exploitation of the rich landowners. Another act that would bring about a considerable social change is the 10-Hour Act in 1847. The women and children can only work for 10 hours a day, not 12 to 18 hours. So we can say that the above mentioned acts would make the working condition in the working sites better and would regularize the number of hours of work for women and children. Another movement that would bring about big social change in Great Britain in the 19th century is Chartism. The Chartist movement was a movement of the working class with a cry for universal suffrage. Now the slogan of the Chartists would resound in the cities and streets of Britain: one man, one vote. So the right for every man to vote. The People's Charter was pressing the Parliament for the universal right to vote for all male members of the society. Now this was a big social change. The Chartist movement would eventually bring about a political reform in the country. As we have said, the hierarchical system will crumble. The exploitative hierarchical system was replaced by democracy. That was a remarkable social change that would happen in the 19th century in Great Britain. With the democracy, every man had the right to vote. And we have talked about the 6 demands of the Chartists. And what were the 6 demands of the Chartists? They would ask for universal male suffrage. Every man over 21 should be given the right to vote. They would demand for equal sized electoral districts. The boroughs will be redistricted. They would demand for voting by secret ballot. And the qualification for the members of the House of Commons, it will not be property. No property qualifications for the members of the Parliament. Anyone should be eligible to run for the Parliament. Now, they also would demand for a payment for the members of the Parliament. Previously, there was no payment for the members of the Parliament. One has to be a wealthy person to serve as the member of a Parliament. They also would demand for annual elections to the Parliament. So these were some of the reforms, changes that were brought about by the Chartist movement. Then we have seen about the Second Reform Act of 1867. Now this act, it would increase the number of men who could vote in elections. It expanded upon the First Reform Act passed in 1832 by extending the vote to all householders and lodgers in boroughs who paid a rent of £10 a year or more. It also lowered the property threshold, which enabled agricultural landowners and tenants with very small amounts of land to vote. So these were the changes, reforms that were brought about by the Second Reform Act of 1867. Then the Third Reform Act of 1884. It established a uniform franchise throughout the country. It enfranchised, we can say, all male house owners in both urban and rural areas and added 6 million people to the voting registers. So we can conclude that the Third Reform Act came close to the introduction of universal franchise, but it did not sanction the universal franchise. The universal franchise for every man, the right for every man to vote was granted only in 1918. Thus, my dear students, considerable social changes were brought about throughout the different reform acts that were passed in the 19th century in Great Britain. The rotten boroughs were redistricted so as to give equal electorate representation. The industrial towns that grew up because of industrialization, they were also given equal representation in the Parliament. The social order founded on the hierarchical system was forced to crumble, and the democratic system would slowly evolve in Great Britain. The Factory Act and the Mines Act laid the basic rules for work in the factory and in the mines. Women and children were freed from the burden of excessive hours of work. Elementary education was made compulsory. Now these were some of the social changes that would occur in Britain in the 19th century. So we can conclude that the different reform acts and the beneficial acts that were promulgated in the 19th century in the Victorian era in Great Britain, that would bring about considerable social changes in society. The boroughs were redistricted. There was no more property qualification to become the members of the Parliament or to hold offices in the Parliament. The working conditions and the working hours in the factories were regularized. Women and children were freed from the burden of heavy work. Education was made compulsory, and the cry for universal suffrage for every man, the right for every man to vote, the cry was heard by the Parliament. So as we can see that the different reform acts would bring about lot of social changes in Great Britain. For your assignment today, please write the answer to the university question that was asked in January 2019. And this was a question: bring out the salient features of reforms of the Victorian England. So based on the discussions that we have had in the previous lecture and the current lecture, you must write an answer bringing out the different social changes that were brought about in England because of the reform acts during the Victorian England. Please refer to our previous lecture and current lecture and write a good answer. Your answer can be up to 3 pages or 4 pages. Thank you for your patient listening. Have a nice time.